Hey, this is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. As this teaching is titled, it's an addendum to our presentation, The Second Passover in the Coming Storm. Our prayer is that you'll watch this teaching and then watch or rewatch that original presentation. I'll be presenting things here that supports this understanding far more than I realized. In fact, though I've made many other teachings pointing to other times for us to consider, which I believe we should still be open to and mindful of, the more I look at Second Passover, the more I find myself leaning to this perspective. Now, I also need to note some corrections in the original presentation. In that live presentation, I made a slide that says it was 3 months from first Passover to the covenant at Mount Sinai. It wasn't 3 months, but rather it was in the third Hebraic month. There's a difference. So, I'm sorry for that mistake. So, when you see this slide, please know it should actually be like this. Also, around the 46-minute and 30-second mark, I discuss how the judgment at Sodom took place at a Passover, and I still believe that to be true. However, there's reason to believe the conversation Abraham had wasn't that same morning. While I believe it was definitely at the same time, I'm not convinced that conversation happened that very same morning. I suppose that could be debated by some, but I just wanted to make sure those points of correction were noted. Since this is a collection of thoughts supporting the second Passover and coming storm presentation, some thoughts mentioned here may not make complete sense unless you see the original teaching. So again, you're going to want to revisit that teaching. First, let's read the verses that discuss the second Passover. Numbers 9:11. They are to celebrate it on the 14th day of the second month at twilight. They are to eat the lamb together with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They must not leave any of it till morning, or break any of its bones. When they celebrate the Passover, they must follow all the regulations. Now, let's begin with our added thoughts supporting this time frame to Yeshua's return. The time, times, and half a time. Of all that is presented in this teaching, I believe this to be the most compelling evidence that points to second Passover. So please follow closely. As I made mention in other teachings, Daniel 12 mentions the time, times, and half a time is actually referencing Moedim. This time frame is specifically discussing a time of judgment on the people of Israel, the refinement of the 6 churches, the tribulation. The words given here are Moed, Moedim, and Chatzi, the holy days of Yahweh as described in Leviticus 23. And Chatzi means half, or in the midst. This is not referencing years, but rather the holy days of Yahweh. The following verse shows Daniel didn't understand this. Why? Because in chapter 8, he was told this time of judgment would last 1,150 days. But now he's told it's only going to last for 3.5 Moedim. We'll discuss this judgment more in the section titled The Times of the Gentiles. In my first interpretation of verse 7 regarding the time, times, and half a times, I associated it only with the feast days, and that still could be. However, that's not what it specifically says. It says Moedim. Moedim means the appointed times, thus all of the holy days, not just the feasts. If we look at this literally, this can easily be applied to the last Moedim of the year. If I'm correct, with the Battle of Armageddon taking place on the 8th day of Sukkot, then we can count backwards for 3.5 Moedim, 3.5 appointed times of Yahweh. In reverse order, it would be Sukkot, Day of Atonement, trumpets, and in the midst of the 7 weeks of Shavuot. Well, second Passover always falls right in the middle of those 7 weeks of Shavuot. It will always be in the 4th week. It shows how second Passover always falls 3.5 Moedim before the last great day of Sukkot. Since I've seen this in Daniel and how it points specifically to second Passover, well, like I said, I find myself leaning to this perspective now more than ever. Next, the timing of deliverance and New Covenant. The Septuagint is basically the Hebrew Old Testament translated into Greek. It's also referenced as the Greek Old Testament. This translation took place approximately 200 BC. To understand the credibility of the Septuagint, please see the 12-minute teaching we have at the bottom of all of our daily devotion pages. It's titled, How Long Were the Israelites in Egypt? Or you can search this video on YouTube. Jeremiah 38 in the Septuagint is virtually the same to Jeremiah 31 in most modern translations of the Bible. You can see how they match verse to verse. This is seen in verses 31 through 34, where the New Covenant is discussed. However, the Septuagint gives an indication of timing in verse 8 compared to verse 8 in most all modern translations. The Septuagint has verse 8 give the timing of Passover as to when this event takes place. And remember, this is in the context of the New Covenant, as verses 31 through 34 shows in both texts. Again, for those who struggle with the Greek Septuagint, I highly recommend watching the 12-minute video, How Long Were the Israelites in Egypt?, on the bottom of our daily devotion pages. This video shows strong evidence how the Greek Septuagint is far more reliable than what many have originally thought. The point being here is, there is evidence for us to be looking at the Passover season, be it the first or the second, for the return of Yeshua. This text shows that just as Yahweh delivered his people at Passover to bring them into the first covenant, he may very well establish the new second covenant after he delivers them at a Passover just the same. The first covenant came after first Passover. Can't help but wonder if the new second covenant comes by way of the second Passover. This leads to Psalm 118. Yeshua said, "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" This is a reference to Psalm 118. This psalm was, and still is by some, sung on the 10th and 14th days of the first month, specifically when they choose their Passover lamb on the 10th day and when they sacrificed it at the temple on the 14th. I've also heard where many would go on their roofs and sing this up to heaven, singing it as a prayer for the Messiah to come and save as Yahweh saved them in Egypt. But again, they did this on top of their roofs. If this is true, this would explain Yeshua's words when he said, "On that day, no one who is on the roof of his house with his goods inside should go down to get them. Likewise, no one in the field should go back for anything." While one may argue this is referencing something done at the first Passover, please remember, just as the same instructions were to be followed for the second Passover, the same traditions would be followed as well. Next, heaven and earth shake again. Since Yahweh said he was going to shake the heavens and the earth again, we have to remember the first time it happened was at the flood. If history is truly cyclical, as the scriptures imply, then we have to be open to it happening again in the same general time frame. The time of second Passover. The flood happened on the 17th day of the second month, the week of second Passover, that being the week of second unleavened bread. So that whole week is something we need to be open to. While there is evidence that seems it would or should happen at the time of second Passover, we need to be open to the thought of it happening in the same timing as the flood, meaning it could happen any time within that week of second unleavened bread, not only at the second Passover. If you don't believe the week of unleavened bread is to be observed at the second Passover, please see our teaching, the second Passover. Next, the times of the Gentiles. As discussed in the original presentation, the times of the Gentiles will last for 5 months as the waters covered the earth in the flood. This will be a time of great devastation for the believers who have to go through the purification. As noted earlier, Daniel 12 shows the time, times, and half a time is the time allocated for this judgment on Yahweh's people, a period of time that lasts 5 months, just like the waters at the flood, the time of purification. There are multiple verses that discuss this time frame. Luke 21. Revelation 13:7. Revelation 13:10. Daniel chapter 8. And Daniel chapter 7. These verses show a time when Yahweh's people go through a time of purification, a time of crushing. The interesting thing about the end times is how we see the deliverance and judgment of Yahweh's people at the same time. The blessing for the obedient and the curse for the disobedient, all together. It's overlapped in the end. The obedient are taken in the first resurrection to be with Yeshua for the marriage year of Deuteronomy 24:5, as Israel spent the year with Yahweh out of Egypt. The disobedient go through the 42 months of judgment just as the rebels died while traveling through the 42 cities during the 40 years as noted in Numbers 33. Both the marriage year and the 42 months of judgment are cut short. Otherwise, no one would survive. Some people believe the tribulation won't start until times are hard and people start crying out to Yahweh as they did in Egypt under Pharaoh. What they forget is that Egypt was good to them until the end. However, what is forgotten by many is that the Hebrews worshipped the gods of Egypt during these good times. Thus, they made Yahweh jealous and angry. This is why the slavery came. They removed themselves from the blessings of Yahweh. This is given to us in Ezekiel 23. It says they became prostitutes in Egypt. Remember, history is cyclical, right? Yes, it is. We know through the scriptures that Yahweh put Israel under oppression by their captors every time they rebelled. Then he'd always come to their aid when they repented, only to have them rebel again later on. But the point is, when they rebelled, he put them under oppression until they repented. And again, history is cyclical. It always is. It just seems many overlook this element regarding the oppression in Egypt. But Ezekiel shows they served the gods of Egypt while there. Knowing history is indeed cyclical, we know why Yahweh removed his blessings from them and put them under slavery in Egypt. Just like with Egypt, it will be the same in the end times. Because of rebellion to Yahweh, he will hand the rebellious over to the Antichrist, just as he did with Pharaoh. And just as Pharaoh was defeated and an exodus took place out of Egypt, he will defeat the Antichrist, and there will be a greater exodus to the Promised Land as prophesied. Again, pictures of biblical history all overlapping in the end times. These 5 months will be the time when Yahweh's people cry out as they did in Egypt. Those who survive will participate in the second Exodus. The second Exodus is discussed in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 14 through 16, and in much of Isaiah 43, and Isaiah 66, verses 19 and 20. So in conclusion, we have the time, times, and half a time, the timing of the deliverance and new covenant, the singing of Psalm 118, heaven and earth shake again, and the 5 months to the times of the Gentiles. Also, remember to watch the 12-minute video discussing the validity of the Septuagint. And again, I highly recommend watching the original presentation with this teaching. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.